So our final snippet for this week looks at the constitutional history of the Civil War, which is, of course, primarily not a constitutional history event. It's military history, African American history, social history, but the how the Constitution plays out is of uh, considerable significance. The backdrop to this is the election of 1860, which, even though it's playing out over a national stage, is really two elections, one in the North between Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Douglas is the candidate of the Northern Democrats, and one in the South between John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, the successor party to the Whigs, and John Breckinridge, who is the head of the Southern Democrats and is the incumbent vice president. And as you can see, Lincoln sweeps the North, and because he sweeps the North, that gives him a majority in the Electoral College. Electoral College has fallen out of favor among many people in recent years, but the 1860 election is one year in which the Electoral College probably saves a more significant crisis. Otherwise, we would have had this four-person race, and it's not entirely clear what would have happened if the race had got thrown into the House. But Lincoln's elected. He has to wait under the Constitution as existed at the time, almost 4 months to be inaugurated. And during this period, this interregnum period, one of the last of the Whigs, this man, John Crittenden, a Whig senator from Kentucky who had succeeded Henry Clay in the Senate after Clay dies, puts together a last-ditch constitutional attempt to prevent the Civil War. And this is known as the Crittenden Compromise. It's a series of constitutional amendments, all of which will be added to the Constitution, which say basically that slavery can remain in the South. Congress has no power to prevent it. It does have the power, according to the Crittenden Compromise, to abolish slavery in the territories. So there would be a possibility of sort of invalidating Dred Scott, but only in the territories. Within the states can keep slavery as long as they want. And in an unprecedented element for an amendment, there are clauses of the Constitution like this, for instance, the structure of the Senate. The Crittenden Compromises say that they cannot be amended. So if these amendments had been inserted into the Constitution, there would have been no way of getting them out. Crittenden pushes Abraham Lincoln to adopt the amendments. He says this is the only way to prevent the Civil War. Lincoln is skeptical of this. And by the time Congress is seriously considering the Crittenden amendments, Mississippi and South Carolina already have seceded from the Union. Lincoln thinks these amendments go too far anyway, and he ultimately chooses not to endorse the Crittenden Compromise. But it's an interesting counterfactual to try to game out how American constitutional history would have developed over the next, say, 30 or 40 years if this thing had somehow been inserted into the Constitution saying that we can never abolish, the federal government can never abolish slavery, and that this can never be amended. Civil War begins. And one of the key issues in the early stages of the Civil War, the South is better organized at the early stages. One of the key issues at the early stages, we go back to this map, Maryland in 1860 goes for the Southern Democrat, Breckinridge, especially because the Baltimore area was quite pro-slavery. Slavery is legal in Maryland. There's a fear that that the capital in D.C. might become surrounded. Lincoln orders the imposition of martial law in Maryland, which is technically part of the Union at this point. Martial law allows the arrest, the detention of people without trials as a way of preventing Confederate saboteurs. One of those is Merryman. He is arrested by the military. His lawyer goes to a federal court. Ironically, the presiding officer in this court is Chief Justice Taney, and demands a writ of habeas corpus, which basically says my client has been unjustly detained. The court needs to issue an order requiring him to be released. Taney dutifully issues the order. Taney is maybe not sympathetic to the Confederate cause, but is not unsympathetic to the cause. And he's very concerned that Lincoln is maximizing power. So Taney issues the order saying Merryman has been released. Lincoln says no. So there's this defiance of a court order. This is not a Supreme Court order. Taney is sitting as the circuit court judge in the Fourth Circuit, but nonetheless, it's a very serious offense. And Lincoln answers it in this very interesting speech, which brought back Congress into a special session, basically saying, look, part of the job of the president is to execute the laws of the land. And if the president has a situation in which he, or eventually she, um, concludes that adhering to one law will lead to the destruction of the entire system, well, the president has an obligation to ensure that the entire system is not destroyed. And Lincoln also argues, says, look, yes, it's true I unilaterally impose martial law, but I've brought Congress back. Congress can vote to ratify this. So I'm not seizing congressional authority. I just temporarily did so. I think most of us would agree that Lincoln's decision here was correct, that he wanted to ensure the Union government remained safe and sound, that Taney's position really was unreasonable in a civil war. But this principle it's a troubling principle. It's basically saying the president can be above the court. And if the president concludes that something is absolutely in the national interest, the president can kind of defy Supreme Court decisions. One thing about the constitutional history of the Civil War is it leads to a dramatic expansion in the power of the national government, largely for the reasons embodied in these charts. So with the Civil War, when the Southern states secede, one effect of this is to create much more one-party Congresses. So the Senate, for instance, once the Southerners are out, is 33-10 Republican. And the House also has a Republican majority by 1861. So the Republicans can pass these laws that affected significant aspects of their agenda beyond the issue of slavery. And three big ones: the Homestead Act of 1862. Which gives to the federal government authority to divide up land in the territories, to sell it very cheaply, and to encourage greater settlement in the West. The Land Grant College Act of 1862, remarkable law in the history of American higher education, using the sale of public lands as a way of financing public universities. University of Wisconsin is one of the universities founded by this, but you can actually go to the Department of Education website if you just look for type in land grant colleges into Google, and you can get a map of the extent of the land grant colleges. There are public colleges or universities in just about every state that are created by this law. Would not have been possible if Southern Democrats were still in the Congress, but they're gone. And then lastly, the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. This fulfills Stephen Douglas's old vision. It basically says that to encourage the building of a transcontinental railroad, the federal government can seize the land and grant that right of way to the railroads. So what these three pieces of legislation have in common, Homestead Act, Land Grant College Act, Pacific Railroad Act, is they dramatically enhance the power of the federal government over matters that very broadly deal with economic affairs. And they're an important part of the constitutional history of the Civil War, even though they don't involve the events of the war itself. Now, those events, culminate in 1864, 1865. Here's the military map of the country. You can see the Confederacy besieged by 1864, divided into two. The Union armies slowly prevailing in Virginia, much more quickly prevailing in Georgia, which sets the stage of how are these former Confederate entities going to be readmitted to the Union, because of course they seceded. There are two major plans for Reconstruction, which is, will tie us into the Foner book where we're going to start next time. One is the Lincoln Plan, which basically says, as long as 10% of your voting population, white male voters who voted in 1860, just 10% say that they're loyal to the Union, that's enough for the state to get readmitted. And any southern state was going to be able to come up with 10%, except for maybe South Carolina and Mississippi, because there were unionist pockets in all of the southern states. The congressional measure, which is called the Wade-Davis bill, which is promoted by so-called radical Republicans, much more liberal in many ways than Lincoln, more committed to what we would describe as civil rights, says that half of the 1860 voters have to take such an oath. It's not clear that many southern states are going to go along with that. It prohibits Confederate office holders from, or people who fought in the Confederate Army from holding office. It repudiates the congressional debt, the Confederate debt, which wiped out a good deal of wealth in the South. And it said that these ex-Confederate states needed to adopt state constitutions that abolished slavery. Lincoln is assassinated, as we all know. This dispute is not resolved. It will be resolved in our reading for next time. But the final element of the Lincoln era in Constitution is the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery under the Constitution. So that's it for our snippets for this week, and I will see everyone in class on Monday.